Anjelica Huston exposes that there are moments, quiet ones, when someone in Hollywood says something without a press conference, without a dramatic announcement, without any fanfare at all, and somehow the silence that follows is heavier than anything words could carry. It settles over the room, it settles over the people who heard it, and it stays. Anjelica Huston is not someone who speaks carelessly, she never has been. She has lived too long, seen too much, and carried too many private wounds to waste a single word. She comes from Hollywood royalty, not the kind that is handed to you, but the kind that gets under your skin and shapes you in ways you spend a lifetime sorting through. Her grandfather made films when cinema was still silent. Her father, John Huston, was one of the most towering, most complicated directors this industry has ever produced. She grew up inside a world of genius and shadow, beauty and hardship, in equal and relentless measure. She knows better than most what it truly costs to survive this business with your soul still attached. So when she spoke about Oprah Winfrey, one of the most carefully protected, most deeply beloved, most deliberately constructed public images in the history of American culture, something shifted. People stopped what they were doing, not because she raised her voice, not because she stormed onto a stage or fired off something online at 2 in the morning, but because of the way she said it. Measured, still, deliberate. Like someone who had been quietly holding a truth for a very long time, and finally decided that the weight of carrying it alone was heavier than the cost of letting it go. Fans didn't know how to land. Some rushed immediately to Oprah's defense. Some went searching for context, pulling up old interviews, reading between lines they had never thought to question before. And some, maybe the most honest ones, simply sat with the discomfort, the strange, unsettling feeling of realizing that two women they had admired for years existed together, inside a story that nobody had ever fully told them. What did Anjelica Huston actually say? What is the real shape of the relationship between these two women? And why does any of it matter right now, in this moment, after all this time? That is exactly where this story begins. To really feel why any of this carries weight, you have to understand who Anjelica Huston is beneath the credits and the awards and the iconic roles. Not the name, not the image, the woman, the one shaped by a life that was never simple, never comfortable, and never designed to make things easy for her. She was born in 1951. But her childhood didn't happen in a quiet house on a quiet street, the way most childhoods do. It happened in castles and on film sets in Ireland and London and Los Angeles, in a world entirely built around her father, a man who moved through life like a force of nature. John Huston was brilliant and restless and consuming. He was not always easy to love, and he was not always easy to live with. But he was magnetic, and everything in Anjelica's early world orbited around that magnetism, whether she chose it or not. Her mother, Enrica Soma, was a ballet dancer. Graceful and beautiful in the way that people sometimes are when they hold something fragile deep inside themselves. She died in a car accident in 1969 when Anjelica was still a teenager. Still forming, still figuring out who she was and who she wanted to be. That loss didn't just hurt her, it hollowed something out and left a space that took decades to understand. She came to Hollywood not entirely on her own terms. Her father cast her in one of his films when she was young, and the critics were not generous. She was measured against expectations she hadn't set and found wanting by people who weren't really looking at her at all. It took years after that, real years. Heavy ones, years of personal pain, and watching other people rise and feeling the particular loneliness of someone who knows she has something, but can't yet find the door. There was a long relationship with Jack Nicholson during that time, passionate, glamorous, full of life on the surface, and ultimately devastating underneath. Then came 1985, Prizzi's Honor. Her father directed it, which added its own complicated layer of meaning, and Anjelica Huston won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. Sit with that for a moment. A woman who had been dismissed, who had grieved, who had waited in the wings far longer than she should have had to, who had quietly, stubbornly rebuilt herself in the shadow of men whose names everyone already knew. And then she walked to that stage and claimed something that was entirely, completely, undeniably her own. After that night, she was not John Huston's daughter anymore. She was not Jack Nicholson's partner. She was Anjelica Huston, and the period at the end of that sentence was final. She moved differently after that, chose her roles with real intention. Spoke in public with a kind of careful precision that you only develop when you've learned, the hard way, how much words actually matter. Which is why when she eventually turned those carefully chosen words toward Oprah Winfrey, the people paying attention understood immediately this was not gossip. This was not two celebrities trading jabs. This was a woman with decades of earned perspective saying something she had decided the world needed to hear. And the world leaned in quietly and listened. On the surface, these two women have more in common than most people ever stop to think about. It would be easy to see them as belonging to completely separate worlds. One in cinema, one in television, one known for complex darkness, one known for warmth and light. But beneath all of that, the foundation of both their lives was shaped by the same thing: survival. Both of them came from difficult beginnings. Both of them had to fight, in different ways and against different kinds of resistance, to be taken seriously in industries that were not designed to take women seriously. Both of them built careers that outlasted trends and outlasted the critics who doubted them, and outlasted the people who quietly, confidently expected them to fade. And both of them, by the time they reached the true height of their influence, had become something larger than just themselves. They had become symbols of resilience, of reinvention, of what is possible when someone refuses to accept the ceiling that other people try to place above them. Oprah's story is one of the most documented in American cultural history. And still it bears repeating because the distance between where she started and where she arrived is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Born into poverty in rural Mississippi, raised in circumstances that would have broken most people before they ever had a chance to begin. She found her voice on local television in her early 20s, and from that moment forward she never stopped moving. By the late 1980s and all through the 1990s, she wasn't simply a talk show host. She was a cultural institution, a force. A woman who could lift a book to the top of every bestseller list by mentioning it in passing, who could shift the direction of a public conversation with a single interview, who built an empire from nothing but sheer will and an extraordinary, almost supernatural ability to make people feel genuinely seen and heard. That kind of power is rare, it is singular. And like everything rare and singular, it drew both profound admiration and, in quieter corners, something else: a watchfulness, a scrutiny. A set of questions that people didn't always feel safe asking out loud. Anjelica Huston was moving through those same decades in a parallel world. The world of prestige cinema, of independent films, of roles that required something raw and real and unafraid. She worked alongside the Coen brothers. She brought Morticia Addams to life in a way that turned a comedic role into something genuinely iconic and strange and memorable. She directed. She wrote memoirs that critics praised not just for what they contained, but for how they were written, with a novelist's precision and an honest person's courage. These were two women at the absolute peak of their respective crafts, operating in the same era, in the same city, inside the same overlapping social world that Hollywood and media inevitably create when enough powerful people occupy the same space. They knew each other, multiple accounts confirm that much. They shared rooms, shared events, shared the kind of passing conversations that happen when people of significant influence move through the same circles over many years. And for a long time, the relationship seemed to be exactly what it appeared to be from the outside: cordial, respectful. Professionally distant in the way that very busy and very powerful people tend to be with one another. Two women doing serious, important work in their separate lanes, aware of each other, perhaps even admiring of each other in that restrained way that doesn't require anything more than acknowledgement. But something changed, slowly, quietly, the way things always change before they become impossible to pretend away. Hollywood has spent over a century perfecting a particular art form, not filmmaking. Not storytelling, the art of appearance, the carefully managed smile at the right premiere, the publicist-approved quote delivered at exactly the right moment. The photograph that looks candid but was choreographed down to the angle of the light. The industry runs on image the way other industries run on money, because in Hollywood, image is the money. Reputation is currency, perception is power, and the people who understand that most deeply are usually the ones sitting closest to the top, but even the most controlled environments have cracks. And people talk not always on record, not always in places where it can be easily traced, but the conversations happen. In dressing rooms and at dinners that aren't photographed. In phone calls that end with someone staring at the ceiling and wondering what they're allowed to say out loud. For years, according to various reports and accounts that have surfaced over time, there were whispers circulating in certain circles about the way Oprah Winfrey operated when the cameras were off. Not whispers born from jealousy, that distinction matters. These did not come from people who resented her success or wanted to tear something down. They came, according to those reports, from people who had been close to her, people who had worked alongside her, people who had, at some point, found themselves on the uncomfortable side of a decision they hadn't fully anticipated and didn't entirely understand. The question at the center of those whispers, the one that kept rising to the surface no matter how many times it was pushed back down, was deceptively simple. Who did Oprah choose to lift up, and who did she choose not to? Her power to elevate someone was not in question. It was legendary, documented, real. But power to elevate is inseparable from power to withhold. And the choices made in that shadow, the quiet decisions about whose story gets amplified and whose quietly disappears, those choices carry consequences that are just as real, just as lasting as the celebrated ones. Anjelica Huston didn't need Oprah's platform. She had never needed anyone else's spotlight to justify her own. But according to what has emerged through interviews and conversations across recent years, there were specific moments, not hypothetical, not general, where the two women's understanding of their responsibilities to other people appeared to diverge. Significantly, in ways that Anjelica found difficult to move past without at least acknowledging. Some of it, according to those accounts, had to do with how women in the industry were treated when no one powerful was watching. Some of it had to do with loyalty, the real kind, not the performative kind, the kind that asks something of you in moments when giving it is actually costly. And some of it had to do with the silence that very powerful people sometimes choose, not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of the deeply human instinct to protect what they've built, even when protection comes at someone else's expense. Anjelica Huston has never been someone who chooses that kind of silence. And that difference, that fundamental, deeply personal difference in how two accomplished women understood their obligations to the world around them, appears to be at the quiet heart of everything that followed. There is something that lives in you when you watch someone with enormous power use it carefully, strategically, selectively. It doesn't have to be done with cruelty for it to cause pain. It doesn't have to be deliberate for it to leave a mark. Sometimes the decision not to act, the choice not to speak, the silence maintained for reasons that seem reasonable in isolation. Sometimes that is the thing that defines a person more clearly than anything they actually do or say. Anjelica Huston has come back to a particular theme across her memoirs and interviews over the years, more than once, in more than one way. The theme of women and what they owe each other. She grew up inside an industry where women were quietly, systematically set against one another, where the roles available were few enough that competition felt existential, where the men who held the power understood, whether consciously or not, that women who didn't trust each other enough to form genuine alliances were women who would never collectively challenge the structure that kept them in their place. She lived inside that world for decades. She survived it. But she did not survive it by forgetting what it cost or by pretending the damage was something other than what it was. So when she looked at Oprah Winfrey, a woman who had accumulated more cultural influence than almost any other individual in American media, a woman whose platform could genuinely change the direction of someone's life with a single gesture, the question that seems to have settled inside her, quietly and persistently, was this: what are you actually doing with it? Not in terms of the philanthropy, which was real and significant and not in dispute. Not in terms of the broad, visible, headline-generating good. But in the specific, human, unglamorous, unfilmed moments. The moments when someone needed an ally and the cost of being one was real, and the choice of whether to pay that cost was entirely yours. According to various reports and accounts from people who have spoken about Hollywood's internal dynamics during the years of Oprah's greatest influence, there were situations involving women in particular, and particularly women who lacked the established power to protect themselves, where questions were raised about the choices being made, where silences were noted, where the gap between the public warmth and the private distance became wide enough that the people standing in that gap could feel it in a way that was impossible to rationalize away. And none of this fits neatly into simple categories. That has to be said clearly and honestly. The truth in situations like these is almost never simple, almost never clean, almost never fair to reduce to a single verdict. A person can do real and lasting good in the world and still make choices in private that wound people who deserved better. A person can be genuinely, sincerely committed to lifting others and still be deeply, perhaps unconsciously, protective of her own position in ways that sometimes come at a cost to someone else. These things coexist in human beings. They always have, because human beings are not institutions or symbols or carefully constructed public images. They are people. Complicated, contradictory, imperfect people. But Anjelica Huston reached a point where she felt the complication itself deserved acknowledgement, not as a weapon, not as a verdict, but as something closer to a responsibility. The same responsibility to honesty that she has applied to her own life throughout her public memoirs and interviews. The truth, even when it sits uncomfortably, is more valuable than a story that feels good but leaves too much out. And the way she said what she said, without theater, without viciousness, in the quiet, grounded voice of someone who understood the weight of every word she was choosing, made it almost impossible to simply set aside and move on. There is a specific kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations, or the kind of public fury that gets clipped and shared and reacted to a million times before anyone has actually thought about what was said. That kind of courage is loud, it burns fast, and it rarely changes anything that matters. What Anjelica Huston did was different, quieter, and because of that harder to dismiss. Across several interviews, not one single explosive moment, but a pattern of carefully chosen words spread across conversations over time, she began to name something that many people had sensed. Somewhere beneath the surface, but few had been willing to actually say. She spoke about the mythology that accumulates around people of a certain level of power and visibility, about how that mythology is built deliberately and maintained aggressively, about how anyone who introduces complexity into that mythology, anyone who says simply that the full picture is more complicated than the one being offered, tends to find themselves pushed quietly to the edges before their voice can reach anyone who matters. She spoke about opera without venom. That is the part that stayed with people. Because speaking without venom when you have genuine grievances requires something that anger doesn't. It requires clarity. It requires having thought through what you actually believe and why, and having arrived at a place where you can hold that belief steadily without needing it to destroy anyone. She acknowledged what opera built. She did not attempt to erase the real barriers opera broke or the genuine significance of what her career represented. But she drew a line, careful, clear, unmistakable, between achievement and character. Between what someone has done for the world in the broad, documented, celebrated sense, and who that person is in the small, private, unrecorded moments that actually reveal what someone is made of. According to reports from people familiar with the dynamics between them, Anjelica's concerns were specific rather than general. They centered on questions of belief, about whose account of events opera chose to accept and who she quietly discarded, about the stories she amplified and the ones she allowed to disappear without comment, about a particular kind of calculation that very powerful people sometimes make, perhaps without fully realizing it, where the protection of an image, of a carefully built legacy, begins to take precedence over the protection of an actual person who needed something real. The people who heard Anjelica's words were not shaken because she was sensational. She wasn't. They were shaken because she was plausible. Because what she described had the texture of something observed carefully over a long period of time, not something invented in a moment of frustration or resentment. It landed with the particular weight of lived experience, and that kind of weight doesn't dissipate quickly. Opera has not responded in any direct or specific way to the concerns that have been raised. No official statement has addressed them. No interview has been given that takes them on directly. And that silence, whatever it means, whether it reflects composure or strategy or something more complicated still, has not closed the conversation. If anything, it has let it breathe longer than it might otherwise have. The reason this is so difficult to look away from is that it was never really just about two women with different experiences of each other. That would make it simpler, and simpler would make it easier to file away and forget. But this touches something older and heavier than a personal disagreement between two accomplished people. It reaches into the structure of the world these women both moved through, a world that has spent more than a century deciding whose stories matter, whose versions of events get recorded, and whose experiences quietly disappear into the space between what happened and what gets told. Hollywood has always been in the business of building narratives. Certain people are granted the role of hero in those narratives. Certain people are permitted to be complicated, human, visibly flawed in ways that read as depth rather than damage. And certain people, typically the ones furthest from the center of power, the ones with the fewest allies and the least access, are granted no role at all. Their experiences become supporting details in someone else's story. Their voices get absorbed into a larger legend that was never really about them to begin with. Anjelica Huston has spent her entire career pushing against that, not loudly, not as a manifesto, but in the choices she made again and again to play women who were difficult, women who were morally complex, women who were not designed to be comfortable or likable or easy. She has always seemed more genuinely interested in truth than in the version of things that makes everyone feel safe. Oprah built something different. Her empire was constructed on a particular kind of truth, the emotional truth, the confessional truth. The truth that makes people feel that their pain has been witnessed and that they are not alone in it. That is a real and powerful and genuinely important kind of truth. It has helped people, measurably, undeniably, but it is not the only kind. There is also the structural truth, the truth about who benefits from which silences, about how power maintains itself across generations, about the difference between the story that gets told warmly and the story that gets told completely. What Anjelica seems to be carefully, consistently pointing toward is the space between those two kinds of truth. The one that feels like comfort and the one that asks something of us. The one that allows us to admire without reservation and the one that asks us to look a little harder, a little longer, at the full picture rather than the curated one. People who have followed both of these women across decades suggest with some care that this is not a story with a clean villain. That observation may be the most genuinely honest thing that can be offered. Neither of these women is simple. The industry that formed them is not simple. And the standards we apply to powerful women, the expectation that they be more virtuous, more loyal, more transparent, more selfless than powerful men are ever asked to be that too, is worth sitting with before drawing any conclusions. No official conclusion has been reached here. No legal matter is at the center of this. What is at the center is something more internal and, in its own way, more lasting. A question about integrity, about responsibility. About what it means to hold real power in your hands and to decide every day what you are going to do with it. There is a reason this story reaches further than the usual celebrity conversation. Further than the familiar cycle of revelation and reaction and social media noise that rises and falls and is forgotten within a week. This one stays. It stays because it is not really about fame or feuds or the private lives of well-known people. It is about something that most of us recognize from inside our own lives, scaled up to a level we can observe from the outside. It is about the distance between who someone appears to be and who they actually are in the moments that cost them something. We live in a world where image is one of the most carefully managed resources that exists. Where the people we admire are presented to us through layers of intention and strategy and controlled narrative. And where most of the time we accept those presentations because the alternative, sitting with the genuine complexity of a person we have chosen to believe in, is harder and less comfortable. It asks something of us. It asks us to hold two things at once, and most of us would rather just hold one. Anjelica Huston has never made the comfortable offer. Not in the roles she chose, not in the memoirs she wrote, not in the interviews she has given about her own life. A life she has described with a degree of honest self-examination that most people, famous or otherwise, would find too exposing to attempt. She has never asked to be seen as more than she is. She has consistently and quietly done the opposite. And that is precisely what makes what she said about Oprah so difficult to simply fold up and put away. Because when a person who applies that standard to herself turns it outward, toward someone surrounded by cultural goodwill so deep it functions almost as protection, the friction that results is not comfortable. You can try to dismiss it. You can decide it doesn't mean anything, that it's complicated, that nobody is perfect, that context matters. All of those things may even be true. But the discomfort lingers anyway, because something in it rings true at a frequency that is hard to unhear once you've heard it. Oprah Winfrey has genuinely changed lives. That is not a small thing, and it is not the kind of thing that deserves to be minimized because it is inconvenient to the complexity of the story. The women who found their voices through her platform, the communities that benefited from what her philanthropy made possible. The cultural conversations her work opened up that might never have happened otherwise. That is a real legacy. It does not evaporate simply because someone raises difficult questions about the private reality behind the public image. But legacies, real ones, are never clean. They never arrive without shadow. And maybe the most honest and grown-up thing that any of us can do as people who consume stories, who form attachments to public figures, who lift certain names into something close to mythology, is to resist the urge to make it neat. To sit with the contradiction. To accept that a person can be genuinely great and also genuinely flawed in ways that mattered to real people who were affected by those flaws in real ways. Anjelica Huston is in her 70s now. She has outlasted most of the legends she grew up around. She has moved through grief that would have silenced many people, through professional rejection that would have broken others, through the particular and relentless unkindness that this industry tends to reserve for women who refuse to disappear gracefully when the industry decides their time is done. And she is still here, still speaking, still choosing her words with the same care she always has, still refusing to trade honesty for the easier comfort of silence. That in its own quiet way is also a legacy worth naming. Whatever the full truth of this story turns out to be, and there are almost certainly still layers beneath what has surfaced. Still conversations that haven't found their way to the light, the conversation that has already begun is worth continuing. About power and what it does to people, about image and what we sacrifice to maintain it. About the women who live their most important lives in the space between the public story and the private one, and what it means when someone finally decides to speak from that space honestly. Without armor, without agenda, just with the plain and uncomfortable weight of what they have seen. Some questions don't resolve. Some truths stay tangled. Some stories end not with a conclusion but with a silence that asks you to keep thinking long after the screen goes dark. This is one of those stories, and the asking, even without the answer, still matters. If this landed somewhere real for you, if it made you think, or feel something you weren't expecting to feel, or ask a question you hadn't thought to ask before, share that in the comments. Not just your opinion of these two women, but what the larger story brought up for you, about power, about truth, about the people we choose to believe in and why. Those conversations are worth having, and they go further when more genuine voices are part of them. If this kind of storytelling is something you want more of, documentary, unhurried, honest, not interested in easy answers, then stay close. Subscribe and keep watching. There is always more beneath the surface. There always is. Sonnet 4.6.